Everybody to Unknown Philosophers Live. It's Friday night. This is going to be episode number 14 of a very special guest, a really good friend of Cosmo and I's. Brother Dash and I got our 32nd degree together about, 5 or 6 years ago. It's been a little while. But we're very excited to have Brother Dash with us tonight. He's a great musician, has a lot of good albums out there. He's going to give us a great presentation on a philosopher that you might not have ever heard of. One last thing, just remember, you can always find us on Facebook. You can find us on unknownphilosophers.com. And our videos are also available on YouTube as well. So we want to just welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us, especially those in the future that are just watching the video. Brother Cosmo, how are you doing this Friday night?
I'm doing great, Brother Briggs. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to have Brother Dash on with us here tonight. Brother Dash is going to be giving us a very interesting topic. Just to give you a little background about our guest tonight. He is a musician, producer, sound healer, a naturalistic philosopher, who has worked with internationally renowned artists such as Grammy Award-winning producer Bill Laswell, Steve Roach, and Byron Metcalf. Dash's driving philosophy is to transcend static nations of divisions, genres, and styles of to bridge the differences between cultures. And again, tonight's topic is about Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and the Prisci Theologi. With no further ado, it's going to be a really long presentation, but it's going to be worth it. Our guest, it's going to be very wonderful. Brother Dash, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much. It's grateful to be here. Thanks, Briggs and Cosmo, for having me. I'm a big fan of your show, and I'm honored to be here. So thank you so much. Today, we're going to be talking about Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and the Prisci Theologia. So I first became interested in Pico around 4 to 5 years ago, when I discovered a translation of his oration on the dignity of man. I was completely dumbfounded when I first found his oration because it basically summarized everything I was interested in at the time in one speech. It kind of brought everything together. It helped me realize, maybe I'm not crazy. All these subjects I'm very interested in. Someone else a long time ago was interested in the same things. So it kind of helped reinforce what I was studying at the time and continues to reinforce that. Things such as Hermeticism, Platonism, Kabbalah, mystical Christianity, and things that could be broadly termed esoteric. The oration is a good starting point for anyone interested in Pico because it's a beautiful artistic summary, basically, of everything Pico was about. It's probably his most famous work, which is kind of ironic because he never actually published the work during his life. It was meant to be a speech. He did write a few books, Pico did. However, due to sabotage by his nephew, Gianfrancisco, less of his works remain than is to be desired. For people who are really interested in starting to understand Pico, I suggest a book called Pico della Mirandola, Oration on the Dignity of Man, a new translation and commentary. This is the translation I'll be using tonight. And it's a little different than the ones you'll find online. So Pico is significant to me because whether one agrees with him or not, he represents that part of the human spirit that seeks harmony and resolution between various traditions and people, even when he may severely disagree with them, which is hard to do. It's very syncretic that Pico would be born as the Count of Concord, as we will see. Of course, Concordia is the Roman goddess of harmony. And again, this is very interesting to me as a musician because, of course, harmony plays a major role in the musical process. And my mission as a musician has been very similar to Pico's in wanting to bring together various traditions and cultures and different styles and find the concord and the harmony out of all the seemingly diverse traditions. And Pico definitely achieved that, in my opinion. Pico is also widely considered to be the founder of the Christian Kabbalah and is sometimes referred to as the Phoenix of the Renaissance. So without further ado, De Conti de Mirandola y Concordia, the Count of Mirandola and Concordia. So Pico's early life, he was born on February 24th in northern Italy, near Modena, in the castle of Mirandola and the territory of Mirandola and Concordia, to a noble family. His family are basically feudal lords that are a military family. He had 2 sisters and 2 brothers. His father died soon after his birth, leaving him with his mother, Giulia Boiardo. And forgive me, Cosmo, on my pronunciation of Italian. You might need to correct some of my pronunciations. Who was determined, so his mother was determined to have Pico pursue a scholarly and ecclesiastical career. So he was born into a military family, but his mom wanted him to be a scholar. So his education, he comes from a wealthy noble family, and so he has the opportunity to have the best education of his day. At the age of 10, he becomes a papal proto-notary, which is basically an honorary scribe or clerk. Going along with his mother's wishes in 1477, at age 14, he briefly studies canon law at Bologna University in Bologna, Italy. In 1479, Pico ends up studying at the University of Ferrara. Here he begins to learn philosophy and ancient Greek. Only 15 months later, in 1480, at the age of 18, he goes on to study at the most renowned university in Italy at the time, which is Padua. It was at this time he begins diving very deeply into Aristotle and his commentators, especially the Arabic Averroes. And again, during this time, he begins to become heavily involved in intellectual circles who were studying Arabic and Judaic philosophy. He goes on to study at the University of Pavia, where he continues to dedicate himself to the study of Greek and ancient philosophy. And around this time, Pico becomes acquainted with the scholarly and literary work coming out of then the famous Renaissance town of Florence. Through his contacts, he then becomes friendly with Marsilio Ficino and requests a copy of Ficino's Theologia Platonica, which was one of the first Latin translations of Plato. Ficino was a Catholic priest and a scholar with a keen interest in text from classical antiquity, especially Plato and the Neoplatonic school. So Pico's access to Ficino's translations of Plato, Plotinus, and the Corpus Hermeticum would prove to be massively influential on the young Pico. Marsilio Ficino, of course, was the first person to translate the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin, and much of Plato's works were translated into Latin for the first time by Marsilio. Pico was among the first to have access to these texts that were otherwise lost to the European world. So this combination of all these things puts Pico in a very unique vantage point to synthesize a diverse range of interwoven traditions. And in my opinion, this makes him one of the greatest syncretists of all time. Or syncretist is basically someone who blends and combines various diverse traditions. So,
yeah, it's amazing. It sounds like he was a child prodigy, and then he gets access to these new writings that probably just opened his mind like a flower.
Exactly. Yeah, it's he was definitely primed to be an intellectual giant for sure. Of course, we have Theologica Platonica over here by Marsilio Ficino, and here's Marsilio Ficino. Now he enters Florence. In 1483, both of his parents have died, and after much infighting between Pico's siblings, he inherits a large portion of his family's estate and becomes one of the wealthiest people in Italy. During this time, he is also invited to Florence, where he begins to rub shoulders with people like Lorenzo the Magnificent, who is the Medici family, and also the ruler of Florence at the time. Lorenzo Medici was patron of some of the most famous artists of the Renaissance, such as Botticelli, Michelangelo, amongst others. Of course, including Marsilio Ficino, who's another one of his patrons. Florence, Italy is, of course, a nexus for the Renaissance, with figures such as Filippo Brunelleschi, Michelangelo, Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Divine Comedy, Donatello, and even Leonardo da Vinci lives in Florence. I believe Pico was in Florence at the same time as Leonardo da Vinci. Who knows if they actually met or not, but that would be interesting. In the next few years, Pico will explode intellectually. He becomes surrounded by some of the most learned intellectuals of his time. He's known to have associated and conversed with many learned Jewish and Christian theologians, along with scholars of Aristotle, Plato, Dante, and Petrarch. He also begins learning Hebrew so that he could study the Bible at a more thorough level. And so it's out of this melting pot of intellectuals and scholars that his now famous ability to navigate various philosophical and religious schools becomes acutely developed. So, moving on here, the Margarita scandal. So in 1486, Pico leaves Florence to head to Rome. He brings a convoy of about 20 associates, including servants and helpers. He plans on living in Rome to prepare for his now infamous or famous Vatican debate. On his way to Rome, he stops by the city of Arezzo to attempt a kidnapping of Margherita, or saving, depending on who you ask. Margherita is the wife of Giuliano de Mariotto de' Medici, who is a tax collector and cousin of Lorenzo de' Medici. Pico was initially successful in the endeavor. However, he becomes ambushed by soldiers sent from Arezzo to recapture Margherita. In this ambush, 18 of Pico's 20 companions are killed, and Pico himself was captured and seriously injured, luckily not killed. Fortunately for Pico, his friend Lorenzo de' Medici, who's also the cousin of Giuliano, intervenes on his behalf, which likely saved his life from execution or imprisonment. According to some accounts, Margherita was in love with the famously handsome Pico and wished to be saved by him. Of course, according to Giuliano's account, Pico tried to forcefully abduct Margherita. So the truth isn't definitive, but given Pico's honest character, it's likely Margherita wished to escape her husband. Regardless, the scandal sent shockwaves through Italy and severely tarnished Pico's otherwise high reputation. This was likely a very hard time for Pico and undoubtedly shaped the rest of his life, for better or worse. And some scholars have speculated that this episode reinforced Pico's belief that our sensuous carnal passions are the cause of much bondage and suffering. Shortly after this event, Pico is known to have finished compiling his 900 Theses, which, along with his Oratio, or Oration on the Dignity of Man, is meant to be debated at the Vatican in Rome. During this time, he wrote a letter to Ficino, and he says that divine providence has caused certain books to fall into my hands. They are Chaldean books of Esdras, of Zoroaster, and of Melchior, oracles of the Magi, which contain a brief and dry interpretation of Chaldean philosophy, but full of mystery. So in this Vatican project, Pico intended to have the Pope preside as the chief, along with all the bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and any prominent scholars or theologians of the time. The debate was planned to happen just after the 6th of January of 1487, which is the Feast of the Epiphany, which commemorates the Magi visiting Christ as a child, and therefore is symbolic of the revelation of Jesus to the gents. So Pico famously puts out an announcement at the end of his 900 Theses, which was an invitation to pay for the travel expenses of any philosopher or theologian who wanted to attend. Of course, it reads, the conclusions will not be disputed until after the Epiphany. In the meantime, they will be published in all Italian universities. And if any philosopher or theologian, even from the ends of Italy, wishes to come to Rome, For the sake of debating, his lord, the disputer, promises to pay the travel expenses from his own funds. And that's at the end of the 900 Theses. So Pico was wealthy and very confident in his debating abilities. So the oration is unpublished until after his death, so it remains free from scrutiny immediately. However, Pico's 900 Theses would land him in a lot of trouble with the powers that were, specifically the Vatican. Pico's arrival in the Vatican on December of 1486 was quickly met with voices of dissent. Pico publishes his 900 Theses, which are entitled Conclusiones Philosophicae, Kabbalisticae et Theologicae, or Conclusions Philosophical, Kabbalistic, and Theologic. Pope Innocent VIII swiftly cancels the debate, surprise, and creates a papal commission to review the theses for evidence of hearsay. Initially, a few of the theses are condemned, but pretty soon all 900 theses are essentially condemned, and all copies of the theses that have been published are ordered to be destroyed, which actually is significant because it marks the first time the church universally bans any book. So there have been local bans on books before this, but the church universally bans it.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's pretty significant there. Pico is forced to write an apology, which he then has to renounce because he kind of just digs himself in deeper. And he has to also renounce his 900 Theses or face excommunication, which he is excommunicated. So here we have an image of the School of Athens by Raphael Sanza. And here it's kind of hard to see, but you have Plato here wearing a red, and he's pointing upwards towards the heavens. And then to his side here, you have Aristotle wearing blue, and he's kind of pointing downwards. So Plato's book is pointing upwards, Aristotle's book is pointing flat. So there's some interesting symbolism in this image that relates to Pico's endeavors. Of course, this is after his death here.
That's so cool. The artist put that in there.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah, for sure.
Here we are in 2020 looking at it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really neat.
Yeah, there's very interesting symbolisms here.
Yeah.
Okay, so post-Vatican debate. Sorry, I'm going a little fast. I'm trying to get through a lot of stuff.
Doing great.
Yeah,
doing great.
Trying to get through a lot of information here in a little bit of time. So you might have to rewatch it or something like that. But anyways, so post-Vatican debate, what happens after this event? So his theses and apology are condemned by the Inquisition. Pico has to flee Rome under the warrant of arrest. So he's a fugitive at this point. He's captured in 1488 and taken to Paris, France. So because Pico has favor with the King of France, he's able to leave France using a special royal permit. In April of that year, he returns to Florence, where he begins to write what will become some of his final texts. He planned on completing a text to definitively harmonize Plato and Aristotle, which was to be called aptly the Concord of Plato and Aristotle. And there's evidence he may have finished this project. However, because of tampering by his nephew Gianfrancesco, there's only a small fragment that remains called De Ente et Uno, or of being and the one. Pico completes a text called Heptaplus, which is a comparison of the 7 days of creation in Genesis with the Timaeus of Plato, which he seems to think there's a lot of similarities there. In this text, Pico's tone is much tamer, much more subtle than the earlier years. However, it's still controversial because it blends the so-called pagan philosophy of Plato with the Bible in a way that's very controversial at the time. It's probably still controversial today. Pico also plans on completing a comprehensive commentary on the Book of Psalms. However, his young and untimely death would come before this project is completed. His final work is Disputations Against Divinatory Astrology, which unfortunately was also unfinished before his death. Seems to be a trend with Pico. In this text, Pico isn't against astrology as a whole, per se, He essentially argues against using it as a superstition as a determinative system to predict the future. So he's against it as a determinative future predicting model. All in all, Pico only has 3 texts published during his lifetime: his 900 Theses, or the conclusions, his Apology in response to the condemnation of the Theses, and his Heptaplus. So there you can see is basically all of his published works, although Concord of Plato and Aristotle isn't completed for his death. So his final years. During Pico's final years in Florence, he would witness the rise of power of the Dominican friar and slightly apocalyptic Savonarola. Savonarola was a Dominican friar, of course, and very religious, let's say. Savonarola was active in Florence in the Covenant of San Marco in the early 1480s. He ends up leaving Florence, but was brought back in 1490 in an action that occurred largely due to Pico's recommendation to Lorenzo de' Medici, which is very ironic. So ironically, Savonarola's return marks the beginning of the downfall of the Medicis, as well as the death of Pico himself. So kind of stabbed himself in the foot there. Savonarola, using his position as a preacher and influencer of the people, becomes an outspoken critic of the Medicis. In many ways, Savonarola represents the antithesis of the Florentine Renaissance. He was a hardcore aesthetic, meaning he despised luxury, and he had a great disdain for the arts in general, and anything that was secular, he despised. Basically anything that wasn't religious, he thought was blasphemy. Although some have argued Pico was a follower of Savonarola, citing the fact that he used his influence to bring him back to Florence, the real answer is more nuanced and less straightforward. There's evidence of, sorry, one second here. There's evidence that their relationship severely soured towards the end of his life. So Pico dies in Florence on November 17th, 1494, at the young age of 31. It's just a year younger than me, which is kind of weird.
Wow.
Yeah, and
he's a young man.
He was, yeah. He dies with Savonarola at his side, which is kind of maybe suspicious, coincidental. I don't know. It's kind of strange. So on this very same day, Pico's death, King Charles VIII, King of France, arrives in Florence with an army of 25,000 men. That's kind of strange timing. You know, Pico is poisoned and dies the same day that the King of France shows up to Florence with an army. It's kind of strange.
Yeah, sounds like a plan to me.
Sounds like something's going on we don't know about. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like we talked about earlier, Briggs, 2007, Pico's remains were tested for poisoning. Extremely high levels of arsenic were found in his bones that were consistent with poisoning. So it's been proven he was poisoned. The general theory is his secretary did it. His secretary confessed to the crime. However,
wow.
Yeah, so his secretary, it doesn't really make sense though. His secretary seemed to be devoted to him. And on top of that, his secretary was tortured at the time of confession. So, you know, when you're torturing someone, they're going to kind of say whatever you want them to. And of course, he was being tortured by people that were followers of Savonarola. So that's kind of strange. So there's some evidence maybe Savonarola was behind it.
Sure.
Yeah. So unfortunately, because of the nefarious influence of his nephew, Gianfrancisco, along with the condemnation by the church, much remains to be desired of Pico's literary legacy. According to the research of Steve Farmer, who wrote a brilliant book called Syncretism in the West, Pico's 900 Theses, which I rely on quite a bit, highly recommend. Pico's nephew, Gianfrancisco, along with the influence of Savonarola, heavily suppressed and edited the works of Pico. So Gianfrancisco obtained Pico's works, notably against his will, and made enormous efforts to sanitize and edit the writings of Pico. Gianfrancisco was essentially, you could consider him anti-Pico. He enjoyed the clean Catholic religious image of his uncle, but loathed the syncretic, worldly, multi-traditional, eclectic side of him. So he really wanted to paint Pico as this kind of good religious person and kind of erase the eclectic, multi-traditional side of him. An example of Gianfrancisco's outrageous propaganda efforts to re-image Pico's legacy, Gianfrancisco basically plagiarizes Pico's Concord of Plato and Aristotle into his own text called An Examination of the Doctrine of the Gents and the Truth of Christian Teachings. And in this text, Gianfrancisco not only plagiarizes Pico, but reverses Pico's high regard of the so-called gents, who are what we call the Prisci Theologi, or those who don't strictly fall under the Judeo-Christian tradition. So Hermes Trismegistus, Zoroaster, Plato, Proclus, all these guys that aren't strictly Christian. So with all that, we'll get into Pico's oration. So Pico's oration is one of the most important documents that we have from Pico. It offers an overview or a summary of what Pico was essentially about in a way we really don't find anywhere. The Oration on the Dignity of Man didn't actually have a title. It was simply called Oratio, or the Oration, if that. More aptly, it could probably be called the Oration on the Dignity of Philosophy. It's probably a better title. Although it was completed in 1486, it wasn't published until after his death in 1496. So surprisingly, between 1601 and 1905, there are no editions of the oration published at all. It disappears. It garners practically no attention until it's rediscovered in around 1905. It doesn't find its way into the English language until 1940. So for us, it's really, really new. It's just emerged. The oration is considered to be the manifesto of the Renaissance because it encapsulates and is a perfect epitome of Renaissance intellectualism and spirituality. So it's mostly known to be in a praise of humanism as the narrative. Pico was this humanist, but really beyond that, if you go deeper, it's very esoteric. It's not just humanist. It blends Persian, Chaldean, Christian, Judaic, Kabbalistic, Hermetic, Pythagorean, Platonic, and ultimately Orphic traditions all together in kind of this big soup. This cohesive doctrine is what we call the Prisci Theologia, which is basically analogous to the term perennial philosophy, as popularized by Aldous Huxley. So it's very similar to the idea of the perennial philosophy. As stated earlier, it was originally intended as a preface or an opening statement to Pico's disputation of his 900 Theses at the Vatican debate. So it was an opening to his 900 Theses. During this debate, Pico intended to unite all philosophy, all religion into one singular truth, creating a concord out of all the seemingly divergent traditions. So it's very, very ambitious of Pico, very brave. So we don't have time to cover the entirety of the oration. So we're gonna go over what I believe to be the core components of it. And here you'll see this image here is the book. I highly recommend, if you only get one book on Pico, get this book right here, Pico della Mirandola, Oration on the Dignity of Man, a new translation and commentary. This came out recently, and it's just an amazing piece of scholarship. I highly recommend just that book right there. So right off the bat, Mercury, also known as Hermes Trismegistus, is mentioned in the first few opening lines. Pico quotes Mercury in his dialogue with Asclepius, saying, "A great miracle, Asclepius, is man." So this sets the overall tone of the oration as at least being somewhat hermetic. And of course, Hermes is known as Trismegistus, which means thrice great. great philosopher, great magician, and great king. We will see this threefold or tripartite symbolism unfold repeatedly throughout the oration. It's the biggest theme. In the second paragraph of the oration, the system becomes more apparent. Pico poetically states, "Man is the intermediary between creatures, a companion of the higher beings, a king of the things beneath him. By the acuity of his senses, by the discernment of his reason, and by the light of his intelligence, he was the interpreter of nature, that man is the midpoint between the fixed eternity and fleeting time, the bond, as the Persians say, or rather the wedding song of the world, and only slightly inferior, as David affirms, to the angels." And what does David affirm? So David says in Psalm 8, 4-7, "For I will behold thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast founded. What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visit him? Thou hast made him a little less than the angels. Thou hast crowned him with glory and honor, and thou hast set him over the works of thy hands." So the central thesis of Pico's entire oration is revealed in these kind of statements. And that is, the human being is essentially an intermediary, having within us the forces of eternal heavens above and the temporal earthly below. And through our free will, we can move upwards or downwards in this kind of scale of creation. Also within this statement, the threefold or tripartite system is unfolded. Notice the order in which Pico says, by the acuity of his senses, the discernment of his reason, and the light of his intelligence. He is the interpreter of nature. So this order of sense, reason, intellect becomes very important and will reemerge throughout his entire oration in different guises and different forms. Of course, we have Hermes over here. And here we have a Taoist rendition of the Trinity, which some interpret as IAO. It's interesting. And here we have the above and the below, the mirror of the macrocosm and the microcosm. So moving on here. So why is the human being created in the first place? What is the point of our existence? So Pico has an answer to that, apparently. In accordance with the laws of his mysterious wisdom, God, the supreme father and architect, had already fashioned this worldly home we behold, this most sacred temple of his divinity. He had already adorned the super celestial region with intelligences, enlivened the heavenly globes with eternal souls, and filled the excremental and filthy parts of the lower world with the multitude of forms and animal life. But when the work was finished, the craftsman still longed for there to be someone to ponder the meaning of such a magnificent achievement, to love its beauty and to marvel at its vastness. So when everything was done, as Moses and the Timaeus testify, he finally thought to bring forth man. So some of our audience will undoubtedly find it very interesting that Pico often uses the term craftsman or architect when referring to God. It's very interesting. Notice he references the threefold pattern in that quote in the reverse order from highest to lowest. So God adorned the super celestial region with intelligences, enlivened the heavenly globes with internal souls, and filled the excremental and filthy parts of the world with animal life. However, the work being finished, of course, the craftsman longed for there to be someone to ponder the meaning, to love its beauty, and to marvel at its vastness. So again, we have this threefold pattern coming up, this time from lowest to highest, to ponder its meaning, to love its beauty, and to marvel at its vastness. So Pico also describes the initiatory process as threefold in his system, claiming that the Apostle Paul was able to perceive this process in observing the cherubim when he was raised up to the third heaven in 2 Corinthians. So this threefold process is a core feature of the Prisca Theologia and is often articulated as purification, illumination, and unification. So this threefold initiatory process likely relates to the many threefold initiatic systems, especially Freemasonry. I'm sure some of you have picked up on that. Pico's insistence on purification before illumination and unification at least partially derives from Plato's Phaedo, where Socrates describes the purpose of philosophy as preparation for death, and how it is necessary for the quote-unquote true philosopher to become detached from the domination of our physical desires and appetites, which is an important theme here. And here we have The Ancient of Days by William Blake, creator, architect, holding the compasses here. It's a very cool image. And over here we have the death of Socrates, the famous scene in Plato's Phaedo, where Socrates is forced to drink hemlock. Here you have his followers all crying and upset, and Socrates is just ready to go, ready to drink that hemlock. Doesn't care.
Socrates is on. He's like, I'm out.
Yeah, he's like, peace. Yeah, he's done.
Yeah.
He doesn't care. So he's ready for death. He's been preparing for it his whole life.
He's like, there's no way to talk to around here.
I need to find whatever is next after this.
Yeah.
So moving on. So Pico, in his oration, goes on to describe the angelic hierarchy of pseudo-Dionysus. And that angelic hierarchy of pseudo-Dionysus is undoubtedly a Platonic syncretism into Christianity. So it's pseudo-Dionysus is his attempt at blending Platonic ideas and Christianizing them. So the angelic hierarchy of pseudo-Dionysus is ninefold. So it's 3 divisions of 3. And it focuses on 3 core components, the thrones, the cherubim, and the seraphim. The thrones relate to the sensible or the animalistic. It's the lower end of the dispersion of the one into the many. So it's the bottom. The cherubim represent the understanding and philosophizing. So the cherubim are the ideal winged lover of the Platonic tradition, the regrowth of the soul's wings. That's what the cherubim represents. The cherubim can also be thought of as the womb or the mediator between the upward pull of the fiery love of the seraphim and God's so-called wrathful judgment of the thrones, which is the counterweight that grounds the above into the below. So all these things are very have Kabbalistic associations, and Kabbalistic interpretations of Christianity, such as these, are a classic example of how Pico's mind worked. He sought the truth through cultures and traditions that seemed to be clued into the same Prisca Theologia, or ancient religion. Pico saw Moses' ascent of Mount Sinai as an analogy for the mystic ascent or initiation in the Platonic tradition. So Moses' initiation on Mount Sinai, gives him the book of the law, the layout of the tabernacle in the wilderness, and the 10 Commandments, amongst other things. Pico and other Kabbalists believe that there was a secret oral tradition that was the esoteric version of the 10 Commandments. And the secret oral tradition is the Kabbalah, which is thought to have been given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And the Kabbalah, of course, has the analog of the 10 Sephiroth, which might relate to the 10 Commandments. It was this esoteric or Kabbalistic oral tradition that Pico found amazing similarities with the Pythagorean, Platonic, and philosophic tradition. This core truth, which we continue to refer to as the Prisca Theologia, or the perennial philosophy, is the way that Pico sought to bring all these traditions together and say, hey, these are all very similar. They're not too different. So yeah, of course, here we have the Assumption of the Virgin, with the three orders of angels here on the angelic hierarchy. And over here we have the Kabbalistic tree of life, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the three major divisions. You got wisdom, beauty, and strength, which are the three main pillars, along with this threefold symbolism you find throughout the Kabbalah with Keter, Binah, Chakma, and then you find it repeated in this downward threefold motion and another downward threefold motion, all culminating in the kingdom, the finality. So you have a lot of threefold symbolisms popping up over and over. And as a Freemason, you kind of take notice when you see the number 3 coming up over and over and over again. So moving on, the oration, Pico relates the layout of the tabernacle of Moses to the tripartite or threefold pattern that has continuously been developed throughout his oration. The tabernacle is said to be the proto-version of King Solomon's temple. It is able to be erected in the wilderness and taken down depending on the traveling habits of the Hebrew people. The major divisions of the tabernacle is the outer porch out here. You have the inner walls, of course, in here, and the center tent over here, which contains the Holy of Holies, perhaps even the Ark of the Covenant. So this major threefold division was seen by Pico as another clue to the Prisca Theologia. The outer porch represents the first phase of the initiatory process, which relates to the purification, overcoming the physical appetites, moral rectitude, and also, if you remember the angelic hierarchy, it represents the thrones. The second stage is the inner walls, which represent illumination, the intellect, reason, learning, and the cherubim. So that's the second stage, the inner walls. And so the center tent, of course, is the third stage, which represents unification or perfection, also known as epoptia in the Greek tradition, which is represented by the seraphim, and it's ultimately, in Pico's system, the attainment of oneness, unity. So these three stages undoubtedly could be compared to the Freemasonic system of entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. It's also quite interesting that this likely all relates to the central alchemical process of negredo, albedo, and rubedo, which you see as the theme of this whole PowerPoint. You got the red, white, and black. So black is the death of the physical nature. And in the white stage of albedo, we have purification, the separation of the spirit from the body. And in rubedo, we have reintegration, the blending of the body and the spirit having been purified. They're recombined together. And that gives us the red color. I know we're running short on time here. We're almost finished here. So in conclusion, the human being is an intermediary of nature, part heavenly, mortal, divine, angelic, spiritual, part earthly, temporal, animal, and physical. Through our free will, we have the ability to either become more animal-like and brutish by allowing our sensual nature to dominate us, or we can become more angelic and spiritual by aspiring to philosophy and the higher things, overcoming our attachment to desire in the physical body. This process of becoming more than human or becoming the next step beyond human, whatever that might be, is facilitated by the initiatory process of the ancient mysteries of the Prisca Theologia, namely the threefold initiatic path of purification, illumination, and then finally unification. For Pico, philosophy is the key to unlocking the mystery tradition. The key tenet of the oration is that there is a Prisca Theologia, an ancient religion, that is hidden within Christian thought, Christian tradition, but ultimately transcends it. And here, I was going to read this whole quote here, but for the sake of time, I don't know, maybe I'll just move on. But here we have a beautiful quote by Pico. You might have had time to read it. What are we finishing at 8 here, Briggs, or what?
You're good, man. We're all learning, so keep going, and then
we can go a little over.
Yeah,
okay.
For sure.
Okay, so dialectics will calm the tumults of reason agitated and tossed about between the contradictions of speech and the captiousness of syllogisms. Natural philosophy will allay the differences of opinion and disagreements that vex, perplex, and afflict our restless soul from all sides. But it will bring harmony in such a way as to remind us that nature is the offspring of war, as Heraclitus said, and is therefore called strife by Homer. Thus it is said in the philosophy, true rest and stable peace cannot reveal themselves to us alone. That this is the duty and privilege of its mistress, that is, most holy Theologi. She will show us the way to this peace, and like a companion will lead us. Seeing us hurrying along from afar, she will call out, come to me, you who exert yourselves in vain. Come, and I will restore you. Come to me, and I will give you that peace which the world and nature cannot give to you. So gently called, so kindly invited, we will then fly away into the embrace of the most blessed mother, like terrestrial Mercuries, with winged feet, and will rejoice in the longed-for peace. This is that most holy peace, that indissoluble bond, that harmonious friendship in which all souls in one mind, a mind that is above all minds, are not only in agreement, indeed, but in a certain ineffable way inwardly become one. This is the friendship that the Pythagoreans call the end of all philosophy, that peace which God makes in his heavens, which the angels who come down to earth announce to men of good will, so that these men would, ascending to heaven, be transformed by it into angels. Let us desire this peace for our friends, for our times. Let us desire it for whatever home we enter. Let us desire it for our soul, so that she may crown the heights of her doors with the garlands of theology. And let us desire this peace for our soul, so that the King of Glory may descend at last, together with the Father, to make a home in her. Very poetically put by Pico. Just very quickly, I'd like to end with a little meditation on the square and compasses. To me, the symbol continues to grow deeper and deeper the more I just meditate on it. And it really encapsulates Pico's entire system in an amazing way. So of course, the square is representative of the earth. The square is all things to do with the number 4, the fourness, the 4 elements, the 4 directions, that downward movement, the salt of the earth, the cube. Whereas the compasses represent the heavens, circular motion, the threefold nature. So when we were born, we're predominated by our earthly nature. Our earthly nature is said to be the death of our spiritual nature. And through the initiatory process, the compasses come to move to be on top of the square. So our spiritual nature is meant to predominate and to overtake our carnal passions. And so to me, the square and compasses, it seems so simple, but infinitely complex. And it really represents Pico's main thesis very, very well. So I wanted to include this in here. And without further ado, here's my info on my websites and whatnot, dashmeshmusic.com, my Bandcamp, dashmesh.bandcamp.com, Instagram, and thehermeticcurrent.blogspot.com.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I don't update that one too much. I probably put more on facebook.com/thehermeticcurrent. I post a lot of esoteric kinds of stuff there. And I also have Instagram, the Hermetic Current. So I kind of relegate a lot of my philosophic esoteric stuff to these things. That way I'm not, doing it on my main pages and whatnot. But anyways, that's it. So
wow, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dash. That was we learned a lot. This I would call him brother. He did find the mystery tradition. And I always find that the mystery tradition can't be found with the mind. It's kind of like the 4th dimension. You can just get shadows of it. The mind can kind of see it a little bit, but you have to go, like he said, as he says, the magus, you can go down into nature, but you also have the ability to go up, is what he seemed to be constantly trying to talk about. I found a quote from him. He says, "We shall become he himself who made us, For he who knows himself in himself knows all things. And, and he's talking to the church fathers, and he says, basically Zoroaster wrote that. So these people show up. We have Count Saint Germain, these guys that get this education where they literally have the internet of their time in their minds, like a Raymond Lull or maybe a John Dee. And when they get access to these documents, like he did from Ficino, and he got the Hermetic doctrine, just like any of us that ever opened it up. The only difference is we have the internet now, so we can go, oh, what does this mean? And he could just do it in his head.
Exactly.
I can't imagine the opera, the book he would have left us had he been maybe with us 10 more years. Can you imagine? He would have got into not just the Chaldeans, but probably, man, he probably would have went into India. He probably would have started diving in, probably would have found the Vedas, and his mind would have expanded even more. Cosmo, what do you got going through your mind, brother?
Well, right now, what I got going in my mind is that when Brother Dash was talking about how Pico was trying to unify, right? He was trying to unify all the religions, and keep in mind, this is during a time when religions were popping all over the place. So it's a reminder of human beings, who we are today. We're always going to be that way. We're always dividing. We're taking things apart, which is ludicrous, because things started together. Things are always done together, and this whole thing about division is chaos, and it's happening now with our political landscape here in America. It's right in our face,
Yeah.
Exactly.
So like the Trinity is there to unite. That's why we have the Trinity, and it's just interesting to see that. And that kind of opened up my mind when we're talking about that.
For sure. I really think his message of concord and finding harmony is a message we could really, really use right now. So it's very aptly timed for sure. It's always probably been this way to some extent or another, but we always have to try to find that part of us that is looking for that concord. How do we bridge the difference between cultures? And it's easy to say, difficult to do. So.
Yeah, you got to get everybody on the same page. I know meditation is going to be a big thing. That's something that, we can all do. And when you get in deep in meditation, you do hit that spot on the inside, that divine spot where we're all the same. That's where we're all the same. That's where we all come from and where we're going. And it's really just understanding that. And I think he found that, in the Hermetic doctrine. He's studying his whole life, the scriptures, and he's studying the Holy Spirit. So he opens up the Hermetic doctrines, and the Holy Spirit is all over it, right? So that must have really blown his mind. And he had the intellect to piece it together, but I think the issue is the other side didn't have the intellect to receive it. And it could also be, it's a higher discussion maybe too. Maybe they couldn't receive it. I don't know. But wow, what an amazing man. Douglas, what do you have for us, my brother?
I was just wondering if, Dash, if you have any idea whether Martin Luther had access to the writings of Pico, because a lot of his work comes almost immediately afterwards. He was born 20 years later, so it wasn't any way that Pico could have known him, or at least he doesn't start becoming an effective writer till the later in the 16th century.
Yeah, I think it definitely, Pico's work probably contributed to Martin Luther's, what he did, but I haven't found anything that directly correlates Martin Luther to, reading Pico, although Pico was highly influential to everyone who came after him too. So it would be interesting to know, if he contributed to the Protestant Reformation and
one of the things, played. Especially because the way they both use the idea of theses as a way of expressing what became maybe their ultimate statements.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely possible. It'd be interesting to know, if there was a connection there, but I'm not completely
worth looking
sure.
into.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah, there might not be a historical, but there's definitely an inspirational connection there, because you look at the old engravings of the first Rosicrucian symbolism, and you look at the dates, and they're 100 years after Luther. So there's this carrying on of this freedom of wanting to be free in one's faith. So that's really cool, Douglas. I would have to believe he was influenced. Just the faith to stand up to the church in any of those periods. To see somebody maybe 100 years do it inspires you to go, well, maybe I'm going to start posting some stuff on some doors too.
For sure. I know Pico was he's kind of considered the godfather of Western esotericism to one extent or another. Of course, there's many others beside him, but he kind of influenced a whole generation of esotericists. Giordano Bruno was influenced by him, but to some extent, along with like Raymond Lull and Kirchner, and he was pioneered the Christian Kabbalah, so he definitely ruffled feathers, and he was inspirational. And
I was interested in his connections with the Medicis and I'm going to do some checking because I have a friend of mine who's on the board of the Medici Foundation.
Oh, awesome!
And I'm going to ask her if is any of the work that they do any work with respect to Pico?
That would be
because especially because he seems to have been connected to Lorenzo before he died.
Definitely, yeah, he was friends with Lorenzo, so there was definitely a connection there with the Medici family. But
maybe
yeah, it'd be interesting.
Maybe find some unpublished work.
Right? Yeah,
they're doing a lot of stuff with that of unpublished work.
Yeah, Pico, there's so much that we wish we could have from Pico, his Concord of Plato and Aristotle, and there's so many works that were, there's evidence that he actually completed his Concord of Plato and Aristotle, which he wanted to definitively harmonize, this fight between who is better, Plato or Aristotle, and he said they were both on the same page. And there's evidence he finished the text, but it got buried. Maybe someone destroyed it. Probably his nephew didn't like it. So that's the problem with Pico, is a lot of his works were edited, and also people tried to get rid of them. So it's unfortunate, but.
And then sometimes we'll see it reappear in like 150 years, and somebody else will put their name on it.
Exactly.
And you're reading it and you're like, wait a minute, I know who this is.
there was a lot of Pico impersonators after Pico came. He proposed 900 theses, which before that it was, to propose 30 theses was a lot before Pico came along. So, 10 theses, even 5 theses was considered to be a large amount. So for Pico to come along and propose 900 theses was at the time completely mind-blowing to people. It was like, who does this guy think he is?
Yeah.
Because it was hundreds of theses beyond what any classical debate would have encompassed. So
I couldn't imagine the debate in his mind as he was putting those together. My goodness. I mean, just the work he had to do, the mind crunch of putting all those pieces together. Again, this is the 1400s. Who else do we have running around? We have Paracelsus running around. We've got...
Yeah, I think Paracelsus, I think it was slightly after Pico. I think. Okay. I can't remember his life. I think it was early 1500s. Yeah. So it's slightly after Pico, but it was definitely a rich time for the Renaissance.
Well, Michelangelo was in his heyday.
Yeah.
Getting ready and to spurt. Leonardo's right at the end of his period. Raphael hasn't yet. He's starting, but he hasn't yet really blossomed. What you showed was from 1516, but Raphael dies in 1520. So he's around. And the Leonardo table, not the Lorenzo table, where everybody sat around and ate and talked to each other. That just had to be a fascinating place. And I'm sure he was part of that table at the Medici Hall.
Definitely.
If nothing, for no other reason than he had so much money. Like you said, he was one of the richest men in Italy. So the Medicis would have probably done a bunch of his banking.
Probably.
If you were that rich, you had to bank with the Medicis. That was,
That's the only bank in town.
Yeah.
And he was the banker.
If you're up north, down south, then you have a different banking system. But there's really only two at that point.
Yeah, but I'm thinking of when he comes to Florence, he still has all of his money. He doesn't lose all of his money or give it away until he associates with Savonarola.
Exactly. Yeah, he actually does. Towards the end of his life, it said that he renounces a lot of his wealth, and the Savonarola thing is debatable. It's debated amongst scholars. Was he a follower of Savonarola? What was that whole deal? And it's hard to see him being a complete follower, just because he was so interested in what we call the Prisci Theologia, and these quote unquote pagan sources of spirituality. These would have been very incompatible with someone like Savonarola. So it's interesting to know what political dynamics were going on there.
Well, Brother Dash, that happened a lot in Italy during that time prior, and even today it's happening in academia. I get emails from different universities, Bologna and Genoa, and so I get all kinds of theses that come in Italian on different philosophy, and you'll see that. You'll have a scholar in Bologna might say one thing on one subject, and then you have this other professor at another university. They're bashing each other, but they're doing it nicely, like they like each other.
Yeah.
But that in reality, that's not what's happening in their head. And that could happen here. It's interesting to do some research and really get into the mind of Savonarola and see what's going on in this guy's head. And it's not hard if you just got to follow the trail, basically.
Yep.
For sure. Yeah. Definitely. There's so much. I was gonna say there's so much more I wanted to get into. I know what was it? We're at 8:06 right now. But one thing I wanted to mention about his 900 Theses is that a lot of scholars thought that he was proposing all these theses as things that he stood completely behind, but that's not actually what his debate strategy was. Very complex. It's not likely he stood behind all 900 theses. He wanted to include theses during his day that were popular, and kind of work his way back historically to more ancient sources. So he included a lot of theses that he didn't even agree with, but he wanted to bring up as a point of debate and show how they were related to more ancient knowledge. So there is a major error in scholarship on Pico where for a long time, they thought all 900 theses were, things that he completely stood behind, but that's not actually what the truth is. He only stood behind maybe 400 of them out of the 900. So.
Yeah, 400 out of 900,
They were published though, right, Brother Dash? I think they were published, right? These were published?
The theses?
Yeah.
Yeah, they were published during his life.
So we can go and then go through them and see, okay, which one like you said, 400 of these, okay, he agreed. And
yeah.
The ones he didn't agree and say, okay, he put them there because of this reason. He wanted to show these guys,
Yeah, he wanted
just to build a good case,
Exactly.
Just to build that case, and when they came at him from the left, he could go that way, and
he wanted to control the debate so that anywhere that they started, he could say, okay, we're going to start with this one. Well, we can then correlate it to this more ancient theses. So he had this very dynamic process where he wanted to kind of be able, because his opponents would be able to start with any theses they wanted, and then he could link one thesis to another because he knew all of them. So he could say, well, if you condemn this one, then you have to look at this one too. And so he had this very intricate system set up to defend what he was proposing.
My uncle told me one time when I was talking to him a little while back. I talked to my uncle almost every weekend in Italy, and we were talking about politics, and that they would say that in Bologna, obviously it's the only school if you're going to be a politician and you're going to be an attorney, that's the school you go to, and they use a lot of Pico's, thesis to basically to support some of the arguments.
Interesting.
In today's politics. So that's why you have a bicameral system in Italy too.
Interesting.
That hasn't been proven, but that's my theory, at least.
The theory, yeah. Seems reasonable to me, for sure.
That's awesome. Does anybody else online have a question for Dash? Anybody on Facebook or anybody that's online with us? We might have covered everything.
Yeah, there's a lot more too, but questions are good. I don't
see any. Well, Dash, I want to thank you so much for being on with us tonight. We learned a lot. One of the other things that was interesting about him was he was going to do something on magic, and that must have freaked them all out when he said that word. And he starts talking about the Magi and how they followed a star, but it wasn't in the sky. It was astrology, it sounds like.
Yeah, I wanted to get into the magic part more.
We're going to have you on again. Let's get into that. Definitely.
There's so much more to go into with this.
To be able to use math, because that's the magic, mathematics, and to be able to connect those lines with the positions of the planets and all that stuff to get the data, which is really interesting. Coming up Saturday, we're going to have Mary White as our guest. She does tarot. She's actually created her own deck that people are purchasing online. So we're going to learn a lot about that on Saturday. So that's going to really
Saturday tomorrow.
It's going to be the next Saturday coming up, not tomorrow, but next. Yeah, it'll be 10 a.m. That's going to be a really cool conversation because I want to learn more about that as well and how that science works. Just want to thank all you guys for joining us tonight. We've got Unknown Philosopher t-shirts now. If you just go to Facebook, we've got a little link on there where you can get a t-shirt if you want to for season 1. We've got a lot of good guests we're starting to book for season 2. And just remember, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube. You can also find us on unknownphilosophers.com. Cosmo, do you have anything you want to leave us with tonight? And before you jump on, I want to thank you for last Saturday. Cosmo took my wife and I and him and his family went out for a hamburger. So we want to give a plug to Murphy's Law in downtown Chandler. That was a great burger. That was a good burger, Cosmo.
That was a wonderful meal, brother. And that's what we're striving to, just to share our time together as human beings and just try to unite our ideas together and just share it with the world. I mean, that's the whole thing. And I just can't wait to see what's, we're almost at the end of the year. I mean, we have a few more shows left at the end of season 1. But again, Brother Dash, that was an amazing presentation. Love to see what you're going to do next time with the magic. We got to bring Pico back with magic. I think maybe we'll make room for an hour and a half for that.
Yeah.
An hour and a half, show.
There's so much I wanted to go into. I had so much other stuff even prepared, but you know how it goes. So thank you.
But,
I appreciate being.
Thanks again, and thanks for everybody for being on the show. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you guys for having me. Appreciate it.
And then Dash, as always, we have a custom we've started. We always ask our guests if they could leave us with a little bit of wisdom to help us get through the week, something we can meditate on. And after you leave us that wisdom, we'll go ahead and end the show. And as always, I'll get a studio cut up, guys, tomorrow or maybe on Sunday. And then you guys can come back and watch the excellent presentation by Brother Dash. Again, brother, I thank you very much. And best wishes, everybody.
Thank you. So I guess I would like to end with one of Pico's theses on music, actually. Let me see if I have the quote here. So Pico says, "Just as medicine chiefly moves the spirits that rule the body, so music moves the spirit that serves the soul. Medicine heals the soul through the body, but music, the body through the soul."